I am going to invite up our first speaker, and Dr. Gupta. Please come up and join me on the stage. While she's on her way up, I'm very excited about Gita's next stage in her research, and as Tracy said, she's one of the newest grantees from LGS Foundation, and I think she's going to take us on a really great trip, so come on up.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about how we can measure sleep in clinical trials. And this talk will focus on what can be measured and how do we measure it. I'm a pediatric pulmonology fellow at the University of Michigan, and I feel really grateful and lucky that you invited me to be here and to have heard from so many different people, so thank you for that. My disclosures are that I receive funding from these sources and soon to be receiving funding from the LGS Foundation as well. And so today we'll talk about what types of questions can be asked, the measurement options, the strengths and weaknesses of these options, and then do these options really apply to people with LGS? And that's an answer that we don't fully know yet. Okay, so what are some questions that sleep researchers can ask? One way that I like to think about this is, are we looking at exposures or outcomes? And so some examples of things that either can cause an effect or be an effect are sleep behaviors, sleep apnea, total sleep time or sleep duration, sleep stages, so that's the type of sleep, whether that's REM sleep or non-REM sleep, sleep regularity, so how much do we sleep, when do we sleep, circadian rhythm, that's a measure of our body clock, hypersomnolence, which is if you're too sleepy at times that you shouldn't be sleepy, insomnia, which is the opposite, can you fall asleep, can you stay asleep, and fatigue, which is similar to sleepiness but not quite the same. It's a feeling of tiredness, but you don't actually feel like sleeping. So an example of a study which looked at sleep as an exposure is a study by Mallow and colleagues, which provided CPAP treatment to people, both adults and children with seizures. And in the people who received treatment, those people's seizures reduced by about 45%. It was a pilot study of 14 people with very variable types of seizures, but that was promising. And then an example where a study looked at sleep as an outcome was a study by Randall and colleagues where they were trying to test a medication called zolpidem, and they found that this medication allowed people to fall asleep about 20 minutes earlier than they normally would have. So what can be measured? Sleep behaviors, sleep apnea, total sleep time, sleep stages, so distinctly physiologic periods of sleep, which can be assessed either typically with EEG, sleep regularity, so like I said, duration and timing. So for example, Huang and colleagues found that both variable sleep duration and sleep timing was associated with increased cardiovascular risk in adults. Circadian rhythm, so this is our body clock. And there are many things actually that have a circadian rhythm. Certainly our level of sleepiness and alertness follows a pattern, as we know. But different hormones, for example, also have a circadian pattern. Pretty much almost everything in our body has a circadian pattern, but not as robustly as alertness and sleepiness. Hypersomnolence, so excessive daytime sleepiness, the feeling of a need to sleep despite adequate sleep time and at an inappropriate time of the day. Fatigue, again, that feeling of heaviness, tiredness, but not necessarily sleepiness. And fatigue is something that's associated with many chronic illnesses, including neurologic conditions. Insomnia, not being able to fall asleep or not being able to stay asleep, or both. So how can we measure these things? So I'm going to go through some measurement strategies and then discuss the pros and cons and tell you about an example of a trial. So a sleep study, I think probably most people in this room are familiar with sleep studies. It is the gold standard. There's lots of sensors, EEG, effort belts, EKG, measurements of muscle tone. It's great because it gives us so much information, but there are many inconveniences associated with sleep studies, and they can be cumbersome, expensive, very difficult to coordinate for both the patient and the family. An example of a trial that used sleep studies, well, most trials or studies in sleep do use sleep studies or questionnaires, which we'll talk about, but a well-known trial was performed by Marcus and colleagues where the exposure was either early removal of the adenoids and tonsils in children with sleep apnea or watchful waiting, and what they found was that early removal of the adenoids and tonsils led to improved quality of life and improvement in the sleep study findings earlier than those who did not receive the early surgery. Data downloads from CPAP devices. This is something that sometimes gets overlooked, but if people are using CPAP or BiPAP regularly, we get a lot of data from that. We can see how well the treatment is working. We can see how adherent people are to treatment. So if we give someone a device but they're not using it, it's not going to work. And we can also look at other effects that the machine might have. The great thing about it is that it's ambulatory, so we're collecting information from the home, so that's convenient. We can get serial data, so we can look at trends over time. But because this data or these types of data are dependent on algorithms and proprietary sort of processes, the accuracy can be variable. It's hard to know how applicable is this information to the patient, how accurate is it. So in a study by Alessi and colleagues, their exposure was cognitive behavioral therapy in a group of veterans, some of whom had PTSD, and their outcome was how well did the cognitive behavioral therapy affect insomnia, but also adherence to CPAP. So they found that cognitive behavioral therapy both improved insomnia and in many veterans, adherence to CPAP as well. Actigraphy, so this is almost like a watch. It's a medical grade device which uses motion sensor, light information to assess sleep patterns, sleep behavior, circadian patterns, and sleep time. Again, the great thing about this is that you can collect serial measurements over a long period of time, and it's convenient somewhat. It's better than going in for a sleep study every night, and it's relatively inexpensive too. Weaknesses are that it may not detect sleep or accurately detect wakefulness in certain people. So if you spend a lot of time in a wheelchair or a stroller, the watch won't be able to understand that this person's really awake or if they're really asleep. It's less accurate than a sleep study, certainly. So an example of a study which used actigraphy is a study by Tsai and colleagues where they provided a education-based intervention to families of people with epilepsy. And they found that the families which received these intensive serial education interventions, the children of those people actually had better sleep efficiency, but not by too much, I will say, maybe about 3%, but that's something. And they also had an increased sleep duration by about 16 minutes. Other wearable devices. So lots of us here are wearing some sort of device, whether that's a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or some like a Garmin, who knows? There's so many out there collecting so many different types of information, including movement. I think movement is the primary type of information, but also heart rate is another very important type of information that these devices collect. And using these data, people have found a way to estimate sleep patterns, circadian patterns, total sleep time, potentially sleep stages. They're cheaper than sleep studies and other types of tools. They're convenient. They can measure a lot of things, potentially, but weaknesses too is it's kind of the Wild West, right? They're less rigorously studied. There's less reproducibility in terms of the types of data that are acquired. And it really depends on the device, the software. So I think it's still a very new field and a new way of studying sleep, but it's also an exciting way. So this wasn't really a clinical trial. I couldn't find one, but a citation if you're interested. Questionnaires. We talked a lot about questionnaires yesterday, and yes, in sleep medicine, we use a lot of different questionnaires to assess things like sleep behavior, sleep duration, estimate sleep disordered breathing, insomnia, fatigue, all sorts of things. They're inexpensive and convenient. They can measure a lot of different, or estimate a lot of things, but they can be variable in accuracy. And the big thing we talked about yesterday was, are the questionnaires that we have applicable to people with LGS? Were they designed for that particular purpose? And so if we give people questionnaires, what type of information are we getting out of those questionnaires? So that same study, that behavioral intervention for families, used questionnaires to assess insomnia, for example. Sleep logs, it's another type of questionnaire. It's a way of assessing sleep patterns. It's kind of like a seizure diary or seizure log too. You basically color in, say in this example, color in the box where the person is asleep or napping. And so it gives us a fairly good estimate of a sleep pattern, but obviously you have to remember if the child was asleep. You might not know if the child was asleep or awake, so it's not perfect, but it's something, and it's often used in conjunction with tools like actigraphy or even wearable devices. Melatonin level. I've heard a lot of people talk about melatonin also during this meeting as a medication to take to help a child fall asleep, but it's also something that can be measured to assess circadian rhythm. And the nice thing about measuring melatonin, usually by saliva, you can see in the picture there are a bunch of little tubes, and you basically it's very cumbersome. You have to provide a lot of saliva to track the circadian rhythm throughout the day for multiple days. So you have to be committed to doing it, but it is a physiologic measurement of circadian rhythm. It can be expensive, inconvenient. Some places have this available, some don't. There was a trial by Van Andel and colleagues. They looked at adults with ADHD who had a delayed sleep-wake phase. So they were basically night people. They fall asleep at night. They're at their best in the evening. They wake up late. And they provided chronotherapy, so light exposure. And they found that tracking the melatonin level, they were able to advance or make those people with ADHD have an earlier sleep cycle and reduce the ADHD symptoms as well. Not fully. I think it was about 12%, but it was something. Core body temperature. Again, this is another inconvenient type of measurement, but it can measure circadian rhythm. Basically, it's very invasive. Usually this is rectally measured, but it is a way of, again, tracking the circadian rhythm. And there was a study by Kimura and colleagues which actually did this to track circadian rhythm in exposure to light. And then just very briefly, how feasible, though, do you think this is in people with LGS? You've all heard now a series of measurement types. Do you really think you would want your children to be in a study where some of these measurement types were being used? Would there be some that are more convenient versus others? In our study of which the LGS Foundation is going to fund, we are hoping to answer some of these questions. We would like to see how feasible and applicable these sleep measurement methods are to people with LGS. What we propose is to, yes, it's a lot of different types of measurement types, home sleep apnea tests, sleep studies, questionnaires, but no core body temperature, no melatonin level, so that's good. Wearing a wearable device, which will be an Apple Watch in our study, doing some seizure logs, providing parental feedback very regularly. And what we hope is that for up to 4 weeks, people are willing to participate in the study, and then we will collect the data over that 4-week period of time to see how do people like these measurement tools? Are they effective? And eventually, too, in comparison to the sleep study, we want to know, are these tools accurate? Well, that concludes my talk. I'm very appreciative of the LGS Foundation and your support for my work and for having me here, and to my mentorship team, which has just been amazing. Thank you.